This is Your Voice, Your Future, Town Hall.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our live edition of Your Voice, Your Future. I'm Armstrong Williams, your moderator. Nathan Worcester and national politics reporter at the Epoch Times, and Raynard Jackson, president and CEO Raymond Jackson's Associates, joins us. My man, Nathaniel, is live on the ground in Greenville, South Carolina, as they head towards the crucial midterm, special election tomorrow, including Darlene Graham and Ralph Norman, and Russell Fry and others who are running to succeed former Senator Lindsey Graham, who passed away suddenly. You know, to give you my 2 cents worth, Nathaniel, I don't think she has a chance of winning. I don't think it's going to be close, not because she's not a good, decent human being. It's just she did not do well in the debate. The polls have never supported her. She may have a lot of money, but the establishment is in this race, and she has not created a buzz. But you're on the ground. What are your thoughts?
That's a very good question. I certainly think there are a lot of people who think that it could come down to Ralph Norman, maybe Russell Fry. There has been some polling, some very recent polling, suggesting that Graham has pulled ahead. On the other hand, this is obviously a race that has gotten a lot of attention nationally, including a lot of national money going to Darlene Graham. I've been getting bombarded all day, in fact, by NRSC, the National Republican Committee ads for Darlene Graham. That being said, as you point out, she's someone, she doesn't have that political background. The debate performance, people could see a contrast between her, certainly also between, say, a Mark Lynch, who's here in Greenville as well, and Darlene Graham. I do, though, imagine that the Trump endorsement, for what it's worth, probably carries enough weight, along with the name recognition of Graham rather than Nordone, for her to be first or second. That would, I say I'm not a betting man, but if I were a betting man, I would still expect her to sneak into first or second, but I could be proven wrong.
Well, listen, all we're doing is guessing. That's why people have to go out and vote and make the decision. Raynard, the controversy over transgender participation is being pushed into sharper relief by former NBA players in its cancer, freedom, and Royce White publicly saying they intend to declare for the 2027 WNBA draft as transgender women, which is a political stunt intended to challenge the logic of current eligibility rules. Listen, there's a reason why there's a W in women. And there's a reason why they've set aside a league where women can compete with women, whether it's in wrestling, whether it's the NBA, WNBA, whether it's tennis or whatever. I mean, the fact that someone has to decide whether or not biological men should participate with women is almost insane to people. It just makes no sense that we are even having this debate.
No question, Armstrong. But remember, it was Gabby Williams, the player, I think she plays for Seattle. She was on TV last week saying that she welcomed a biological male being in her being in her locker room, playing with her and in the league. And so now she's going to get what she wants, Armstrong, because no matter what the response of the WNBA and the Players Association is to this issue, they're going to piss off their diehard base, which is radical left. And remember, Armstrong, I did a column a couple weeks ago, given the history of the WNBA. They were started by David Stern, who was then the head of the NBA. They specifically set this league up not to get women more involved in professional basketball, but to promote this liberal agenda. That's what the whole rationale was, and now it's about to blow up in their face.
Nathaniel, why has it become so difficult to discuss biological differences without the conversation immediately becoming ideological?
That's a great question. And to me, what's interesting is that one of the pioneers of that ideology, Richard Raskin, I believe his birth name was, who went by and goes by Renee Richards, if you recall, in the 1970s, competing in the women's tennis competitions despite being born a biological male. Renee Richards has come out recently and said that in a case like that of Renee, someone who actually went through male puberty, they wouldn't support participation in a female league. So even the people who were kind of leading the ideological charge at one point in time are rethinking at least aspects of where they stood in the past. I think it is one of those fundamental issues where you find yourself in conflict, I think, with multiple factors, not just ideology, but often very deeply held religious beliefs. And then on the other hand, I think such a strong conviction that the tide of progress is such that there needs to be a change in this issue. I think that really people have heartfelt convictions on this in a way that allows them to feel as though compromising at all amounts to a deep personal compromise.
You know, Raynard, today our president signed an order calling for childhood vaccinations to be spaced across separate visits and pushing for the combined MMR vaccine to be separated. Now, the move conflicts with guidance from major medical organizations and intensifies an already fierce debate over vaccine policy. So, is spacing vaccines a reasonable application of parental choice or an intervention unsupported by evidence?
Well, Armstrong, that's an interesting question. This boils down to, in my view, who has the right to tell your kid what you're going to inject in that kid's body? And I think it's the family, the parents, who have the choice of that. Now, I think there's more than ample studies out there, Armstrong, that's saying spreading out all these injections into a kid's body over a period of months versus doing it all at one time. That's just common sense to me, Armstrong. But even if it was contradictory research on that issue, the bottom line is the parent has the final say so, not the government. And that's one of the things we learned from the virus under Fauci, that the government had lied to us. And the medical institutions, Armstrong, the American Medical Association, AMA, they have been hijacked willingly by liberal orthodoxy, and a lot of their research is bought and paid for by the pharmaceutical and are not objective studies.
You know, quickly, Nathaniel, so we move on to another topic. What scientific evidence would justify changing a vaccination schedule that has protected generations of children?
Well, that's a great question. I'll stress that I'm not a scientist. Coming at this as someone who I've paid attention to some of what has been coming out of HHS, some of the attention to the vaccine schedule. I think it is understandable that the notion of simply, for example, abandoning all vaccination, abandoning what has amounted to over the course of centuries, pretty transformative medical technology, that seems pretty foolish. And indeed, it becomes difficult to look at cases like people who just do not vaccinate their children at all. And despite, I think, the healthy American presumption in favor of liberty, then thinking, well, that was a wise decision. On the other hand, when we look at some of these comparisons between the U.S. vaccine schedule and the vaccine schedules in other countries, not simply necessarily the number of vaccines, but also their timing at different stages of infancy or youth. Again, I would stress I'm not a doctor, so I hesitate to weigh in on that at all. But it also strikes me that there's an incapacity in this debate to avoid extremes, and points of comparison outside the U.S. might actually be useful for attempting to come to a sane policy.
It looks like it's raining pretty hard in Greenville, my man.
It is. We've got a storm coming through, so I hope it's not overwhelming my commentary here.
You're doing just fine. You know, Raynard, the Iran confrontation remains extraordinarily consequential. Tehran is tying reopening the Strait of Hormuz to sweeping demands, including sanctions, relief, and other U.S. concessions, while negotiations continue through regional intermediaries. And even the president said today he wants Iran to now pay us of some form of reparations for the money that we spent there in terms of our own resources. At what point, Raynard, does negotiation become capitulation? And should Trump refuse sanctions relief until Hormuz is fully reopened?
Well, I think short of kinetic warfare, Armstrong, the best move the president has is economic sanctions and to starve the economy. Right now, their inflation is 300% or something to that effect. He needs to clamp down not only on Iran through financial sanctions, but any other country that's buying goods to or from them need to be sanctioned as well. Because Armstrong, let me tell you something. This conflict is over in the sense that the best America can hope for at this point is a way to save face. And no option that's on the table is going to make Trump look good. And so he needs to cut his loss and get out and try to salvage the elections come November.
You know, Nathan, tariffs, elevated energy costs tied to the Iran conflict, employment uncertainty, and the directions of interest rates create another, just another critical point for Americans who will continue to suffer, especially when you look at recent analysis, continue to find that significant household costs associated with administration of tariff policies. Are Trump's tariffs rebuilding American industry quickly enough to justify their short-term costs?
Well, that is a good question. I think it actually ignited a debate within the Senate over the president's tariff power that would come effectively with the recent sanctions package that was passed. And yet Rand Paul's amendment to that effect didn't go forward. We are seeing, and this is more medium term than short term, some signals of, for example, factory construction, indications that at least some of the attempt to rebuild, reattract domestic industry, especially in national security critical sectors, that is yielding, if not clear, decisive, positive results than the beginnings of such results. But certainly in the short term, it varies from industry to industry. I think you look at tariffs, and you always have to come at the cost-benefit analysis in a way that you do, for example, with the Iran war. Some people would assess the decision to strike and then to continue the strikes, the effect that that's had on gas prices, less significantly now than since April or, say, late July. And they would wonder, was the cost-benefit analysis worth it? I do think that the unfortunate fact is, unfortunate or fortunate, depending upon how you think about it, policies that may have positive results fiscally, and I would actually include here in particular entitlement reforms, when it comes so soon or when there's the threat of really bad outcomes in an election, as with the midterms, politicians are going to feel a strong disincentive. People are going to be looking at their pocketbooks, as they always do come election season, and they will most likely vote accordingly. And if they feel the economy is very bad, which I think remains an open question how people will feel in November, but if they feel that it's at the very least not much better than it was back in 2024, well, then I would expect there to be a pretty bad outcome for the Republicans.
You know, quickly, Raynard, before we say goodbye to you both, Abdul El-Sayed's Democratic Senate primary victory provides a fascinating political question. Progressive politics you can discover so many things because you have these affluent, highly educated voters while encountering resistance from some traditional Democratic constituencies. Is the Democratic Party's ideological center increasingly being defined by affluent white progressives rather than the working class Hispanic voters and especially black voters?
Without question, Sean, the Democrats have lost control of their party and the party's agenda and values. I don't think they're going to recover from this. And Michigan, Al-Sayed should get defeated roundly and soundly by Mike Rogers. Can't take it for granted. But the Democratic Party is in a big way of hurt going forward, Armstrong.
Listen, I wish you well in South Carolina, my home state. Nathaniel, I love it there. And Raynard, it's always a pleasure to see you. Back with much more as we discuss with Robert Kennedy Jr., well, the third, and Dr. Bryan Donohue, Dr. Anthony Fauci. That's up next. Robert Kennedy III, author of The Confessions of Anthony Fauci, and Dr. Bryan Donohue, cardiologist, here, and one of our special physicians for Your Voice, Your Future, joins us. So let me start here with my guest. Dr. Donohue, why did Dr. Fauci take the field when he already had presidential immunity? And what does President Biden's preemptive pardon actually cover?
Well, it's actually the first time, Armstrong, that I think Dr. Fauci saw a microphone that he didn't like. But the reason that he took the fifth is as follows. He has testified previously on a number of occasions, Armstrong, to Congress, both in the House and the Senate. And Dr. Fauci has a pardon, as you pointed out, from President Biden, but it ends in January of 2025. So if he, in July of 26, testified in a fashion that was in any way contradicting his other prior testimonies, that would not be covered. So his counsel apparently felt it was a good idea to not run that gauntlet, and so he did not testify. What the pardon means, it covers about a 10-year period, and it covers him in a carte blanche way, Armstrong. It's just a categorical pardon, but it doesn't cover future events. And so that's really the issue here. So his concern was that it would be very easy to get tripped up based on the mountain of testimony he's provided previously, but it does deprive the American audience of an opportunity for resolution, which we are very much in need of.
Robert, let me welcome you back to our broadcast house. What does invoking the Fifth Amendment legally mean, and what does it not mean? And also, what did you watch during the Fauci hearings that you were really struck by?
You know, I think I'm most struck by, well, just sort of how embarrassing it was. Obviously, pleading the fifth is invoking your right not to self-incriminate, which I believe is a very amazing right, you know, in our country. But generally, people that have a full pardon don't have to go there. I think aside from him and a few, kind of mafia guys back when when my grandfather was suing the Teamsters, nobody really has gotten a pardon or immunity and still pled the fifth like that. And so that was striking. I think what happened today was striking, where we got more evidence through Senator Ron Johnson about his texts about Fauci's texts, some of which were saying that the chance of a first trimester, what's it called? It basically had the same record as the abortion pill, which is so crazy, and they covered that up by kind of juking the stats. So that, to me, is unacceptable, despicable. I think he's going to go down. He may have a federal pardon, but the states can still come and get him.
Dr. Donohue, what is the practical significance of the committee's contempt vote and referral to the Department of Justice?
Well, it's interesting that Chairman Ron Paul chose not to have the whole Senate vote on this, but the committee voted on it. And so it will now go to the Department of Justice, where there will be thought given as to whether or not there's a crime and whether that crime can be prosecuted. So it's not a good thing for Dr. Fauci, but really, as Mr. Kennedy kind of points out, it's the big losers here are Americans who looked to Dr. Fauci for guidance during a terrifying period that most of us remember vividly. And that's the baby that got tossed in the sleigh here. It really could have been a very different thing where, for example, he shared with us his thoughts at the time. He didn't have to be right. He didn't have to be foolproof in what his thinking was. This is still an inexact science, this business of medicine. But as Bobby points out, to take the position that he's not going to offer any new insights puts him in a strange cabal of people that we all know and think of as criminals.
Bobby, does the matter require action by the full Senate before the Justice Department can pursue it? And what are they actually pursuing?
Well, it needs like a top, up or down vote in the Senate. Luckily, I think the votes are there for that. And, it's a little worse than a slap on the wrist, given the immense damage that he's done to our nation and to the institution of science and to all the individuals. It's, I think a year in prison is the maximum sentence. But as I said earlier, the states can also go after him. And if it seems like, he was engaging in a criminal cover-up that ended up in people dying, there's not necessarily a statute of limitation there. So he could get locked up, in my opinion, for the rest of his life. Need an aggressive lawyer, I wish they'd put my dad on it, but he's busy, I suppose. But, I think as more and more of these texts come out, we're going to have more and more documentary evidence that he lied directly in front of Congress. And I think he'll just keep getting called back. And, if not that, even putting him in jail for a year, at least will send the message to the next guy that, we're not messing around anymore.
Dr. Donohue, what is it that Dr. Fauci needs to answer?
Well, there's so much, Armstrong. Let's just remember, all of us, back in January and February of 2020, when the messaging was inconsistent, shifting almost on a daily basis. I'll just share with the audience that for those of us that were actually taking care of patients in those early days, we were using what we had, which was hydroxychloroquine, ivermectin, things like that. And physicians were put in a very uncomfortable position by this heavy-handed messaging that came from our thought leaders in healthcare, Dr. Collins, Dr. Fauci, and so forth. And I did use those agents at that time, and I'm glad I did. And it's just, the point just is that there was this heavy-handed messaging. First, don't wear masks, although all of us in the hospital and in offices were certainly wearing masks. Then wear masks. Then keep this 6-foot distance. And again, it would be one thing to say, we don't have data on this, but this is how aerosolized secretions work, and this is a reasonable thing. That's what was actually the case. But there was no hard data. And again, it's okay to not know the answer. But what's not okay is to not know the answer and assert that you do. Dr. Fauci has said again and again that he didn't personally close schools, but we all know now that he spoke to the mayor of New York and he spoke to the governor of California and asserted that those things should be done, and they were done. We know that the vaccine mandate rose up from this kind of thought central area that Dr. Fauci was at the epicenter of. And you and I have discussed this publicly many times in the past. But forcing people to get vaccines that they don't choose to get is not in the vocabulary of any doctor. We leave that up to the professionals, to the thought leaders like Dr. Fauci.
Bobby, it is interesting, Dr. Fauci's private versus public discussions when you go back to his diary that he kept, or if you go back to his cell phone that the Senate subpoenaed and have now are going through, and particularly where he's talking about women's fertility. The fact that he had suspicion that this could impact women in their childbirth, especially when they showed signs of things that just did not add up after the second shot. It's one thing to debate this. Scientists do this all the time until you find the clear evidence, but not to alert them that this was a possibility?
I agree, it's despicable. And, the other crazy thing about this is he was caught red-handed destroying evidence. In those Daszak emails, they talk about how he can get things around to his personal email. So I believe that there's way more. This is the tip of the iceberg. And, his real motivations, which probably had to do with making people a lot of money, in addition to just protecting the science and such, and continuing kind of the emergency use authorization, which had a drug like ivermectin been, given a fair test, it could have basically cured people that had, dangerous levels of COVID. So, I think we all kind of know what he was really doing here. And the reason that he was pleading the fifth is because he was part of an actual criminal conspiracy. It's not just poor judgment.
Dr. Donohue, talk about his vaccine transmission claims.
Well, in the early days, you'll remember that the assertion was that you get a vaccine so that you don't get COVID. We all learned soon enough that that wasn't the case, that the real benefit of the vaccine, which is still a matter of debate now, as you know well, was that if you get COVID, you'll have some antibody production, and it'll be a mild to moderate disease, not a moderate to severe disease. That was the original iteration. And to some extent that bore itself out. What also was happening, though, Armstrong, in those early days was the virus itself was changing. So the first two variants of the virus were very dangerous creatures. But as usually happens with viruses, they become less virulent and more contagious as they mutate. And that's really what happened. So some of the credit that's been given to the vaccines might as well be given to the natural evolution of the virus and the development of immunity, herd immunity in one form or another through vaccine or exposure on the population. So it was very concerning, though, to me that, again, we didn't fess up that there were simply things that we didn't know. This is an mRNA vaccine. That's a deeply personal level of your physiology, the way in which you transcribe proteins. So nobody can say, honestly, that fooling with the messenger RNA doesn't have downstream consequences. The jury, sadly, is still very much out on that, and bad things like lymphoma and so forth are still not off the table.
You know, Bobby, what about the natural immunity? Why wasn't prior infection and natural immunity given greater consideration in federal recommendations and the mandate policies?
Well, if I had to put on my tinfoil hat, I would say it's because if they had a large group of people that never took the vaccine, it would be way easier to see in population level studies what sort of damage the vaccine was actually doing. So in order to obfuscate that, they made this massive push where everybody had to get it. And, they kind of made it impossible to study by, throwing out the studies, giving everybody in the studies the vaccine after 60 days, or maybe it was 6 months. But, piggybacking on that, we keep calling it a vaccine, but before they changed the definition of the word vaccine, for this purpose, it wouldn't even have been called a vaccine. mRNA gene editing technology is probably closer to the truth. And, I just don't think that would have sold as easily. So change the dictionary rather than change the shot.
This is Your Voice, Your Future. I'm Armstrong Williams. Bobby Kennedy III, Dr. Bryan Donohue. We'll be back. I want to be clear that Dr. Fauci to date has not been charged with anything. Dr. Donohue, let's talk about the myocarditis, okay? Which is, when do you think the public first became aware, and Dr. Fauci is a team linking the mRNA vaccinations with elevated myocarditis risk, and also particularly among adolescents and young adult males, which became a big issue? And how quickly was that information communicated publicly, or was it communicated quickly enough?
Well, I take care of a lot of professional athletes, most of them male, not all of them, many of them young. And the occurrence of myocarditis, just for our viewers, anything that ends in itis means inflammation. So myocarditis is heart muscle inflammation. And it was a very interesting thing that occurred early on in the course both of the illness and the vaccine. So certainly by May or June of 2020, it was more than a rumor, but less than a fact. As time went on in 2020, it became clearly the case that young men in particular, typically between the ages of 16 and 22, were at risk for segmental inflammation of the heart muscle. And they typically presented with chest discomfort, like people with any form of embarrassment of the heart muscle strength. Their blood work showed evidence of small heart attacks. Imaging studies, meaning ways of looking at the heart muscle strength, showed some weakness in the heart muscle. And probably because of my activities at the time with these athletes, I saw a lot of it. And so by the time we were into the end of the summer of 2020, this was a fact. It's never been fully explained. Why is there a gender piece to this? Why is it typically young individuals? Oh, that's not a categorical thing, but it is most prevalent among young people. Those things are not still in hand. But remember that we're fooling here with a fundamental thing, which is the body's system of inflammation. And it got upregulated in a way here, either as a consequence of the illness or the vaccine or both, which really had treacherous consequences for a very unique group of people.
You know, Bobby, let's talk about the scientific descent of where government officials and scientists and others were marginalized their viewpoints and they were weaponized for speaking out. Talk about that aspect of this conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of one, if not the scariest part of this whole thing, is that the companies seem to be actively working with the Biden administration, especially with the big social media companies, to pull, cancel, defame doctors. You know, the doctors were losing their licenses for prescribing ivermectin, and it was too crazy of a situation with to be just a natural screw up. You know, hey, we got a few things wrong. It was a targeted effort to suppress doctors, to silence dissenters. Yeah, my father was part of the disinformation dozen, who all lost their social media, Facebook, Instagram, and really the only way that my dad even got back online was that he started running for president, and I guess that became a First Amendment legal challenge, taking away his voice. But there was a lot of people that still don't have their social media accounts, a lot of doctors that still haven't got their licenses back, people that lost their jobs. But it was, there's nothing else to say, but it was an organized smear campaign and a conspiracy. I believe that's the definition of the word conspiracy right there.
You know, I've had opportunity to sit down with you on many occasions, Bobby, and I've never seen you so upset as I see you this evening. I can tell this is certainly something that you really care about and have passion for.
Yeah, I'm fired up, but today was a big day. We're gonna keep having, great days too, and we'll see this guy. He's going down.
Dr. Donohue, let's talk about the conflicts of interest with the NIH relationships with pharmaceutical companies, research institutions, patent royalties, and you know a lot about that, are federally funded researchers create conflicts or appearances, Dr. Donohue, of conflicts that should have been disclosed more clearly.
Well, I think that's exactly right. And as Sigmund Freud once asked, what's the motive? Why was there this intense opposition to any opposing point of view? Why was that? And I think that there is a money chain here that can be followed. The hard, unbending pragmatic is that our taxpayer dollars did fund gain of research work in a lab in communist China. Now, a person of goodwill might ask, well, how did that happen? And so it's just wrong at all levels. So it does create maybe an obligation, if you were somehow part of that, to cover that up. And I feel like that was that it was clear from the first 6 months or so that this was not something that came from the wet market and the bats and so forth. And you may remember there was a basic scientist at MIT who herself had emigrated from China and persuasively identified the cleavage plane in the DNA sequence of the virus, which made it clear this was an engineered product. So yes, there was all kinds of reasons, if you were part of this whole thing, either intentionally or even inadvertently, to have funded this kind of treacherous research, for which there were clear guardrails at the time and still are, and do it in China, where the hurdle for escaping is knee high, not head high. And so when all of this swept its way into the public landscape, there was lots of reasons to duck low and to deny this with fervor. And Bobby's point needs to be emphasized without equivocation. The people who dissented were punished hard, not just by the government, by our professional groups, by the American Medical Association. I was speaking out at that time about the value of hydroxychloroquine. In my own experience, there were 2 studies that suggested that was the case. Can I just take a minute to remind you, Armstrong, that the initial physician in Wuhan who first began to describe this process of COVID in September and October of 2019 pointed out that there were 153 patients in the hospital in Wuhan that were on hydroxychloroquine because they had lupus and related immune disorders. You would reason those people were more at risk for this disaster. It turns out not one of them got it. So it raised a legitimate question as to the potential protective effect of this. But those of us who had an interest in that, or heaven forbid, used it, were severely punished, as Bobby points out.
Bobby, Dr. Donohue is going to stay with us. Your final thoughts on this topic, something that we may not have covered?
Well, I just believe, we have a great chance here to make sure something like this never happens again in America. And, I think that you've been so great about your kind of relentless coverage of him, but the sort of legacy mainstream media, like, where's the New York Times on this? Where's the Washington Post? Where's CNN? Why won't they say anything? I mean, this is beyond obvious. They're beyond the pale in my situation. And, if they continue acting like this, I hope they all go down together.
Bobby, it's always a pleasure seeing you. Go get yourself some rest and relax. All the best. Dr. Donohue, we'll be back with much more. Don't go away. Lewis County is not joining us. Lou, no, as the author of the MAHA report. Lou, welcome back. President Trump is not calling for childhood vaccines to be spaced out. Is there compelling scientific evidence that spacing vaccines improves safety, or is this primarily about restoring parental confidence and choice?
I think it does restore parental confidence and choice and kind of balances a system that got out of control here, where, in many instances, states removed religious exemptions, even removed to the point of absurdity, medical exemptions in certain states. What is important to keep in mind about what the president did by deciding that vaccines should be spread out is that no studies have been done that significantly measure the cumulative impact of multiple vaccines. They're all studied in isolation, and not all of them are studied very thoroughly. So I think in many ways this is a prudent, reasonable decision, and some good leadership here by President Trump and Secretary Kennedy.
Yeah, but critics would say changing the schedule risks lowering the vaccination rates and the return of preventable diseases, Lou. What is your answer to those who feel that's exactly what will happen?
Well, I think if you look at the vaccines that were removed, many of them, including significantly the hepatitis B vaccine, which is a sexually transmitted disease whose efficacy seems to last about 7 years, any immunity from it seems to last about 7 years, was given on the first day of birth to mothers who still tested, negative for having had hepatitis B. So, some of the vaccines, removing them is not going to have a measurable impact on the diseases themselves. What I will say is that we have to make some decisions here about when we look at vaccine schedules in other countries, and the schedule that the president is suggesting aligns us with peer nations, and they do not have disease rates that are higher than ours. And in fact, when you step back and look at overall health outcomes, in many instances, they are better than ours. So I think, this is a reasonable measure. Will there be issues with it? There might, but there are issues with the current schedule.
Dr. Donohue, should parents have the right to request individual vaccines rather than combination shots when medically available?
Well, Armstrong, I think, we were just talking a few moments ago about the authority of government in adjudicating health issues. And I think we overstepped that boundary very clearly by, for example, mandating the COVID vaccine. Having said that, there is data that suggests that if we get permissive, that means really permissive, with exemptions, for example, oddly enough, California carefully studied this, and as the exemption prevalence went up for the measles vaccine, so did, not surprisingly, so did the occurrence of measles. So we have to take the scale firm in hand. If we make an adjustment, then we sort out its options in a kind of dispassionate way. One of the things I've been concerned about is the insertion of ideological prerogatives into the domain of science. We should just be innocent advocates of what we think is the truth and not promoters of a worldview or a diet. And I think the other thing just to mention is that maybe the most well-studied thing in medicine, not just cardiology, but the whole panorama of medicine, is the putative relationship between vaccines and autism. And it is simply not data-based in any fashion whatever to assert that that's the case, that there is such a relationship. So if you think it's a good idea to open these things up for other reasons, fair enough. Look and see what the answer to the questions, Armstrong, that you pose really are. But it is clearly the case this year in 2026 that we have more measles by the end of July than we had in all of 2025, and 2025 itself was a banner year for the occurrence of measles. So we just, again, need to tell the truth as best we can, and we do that simply by following the data.
So, Lou, the newly released Fauci communications have reignited debate over what public health officials discussed privately during COVID. Do these disclosures change your understanding of what officials knew about the vaccine risk and uncertainties?
Well, first of all, what occurred today was the release of some texts that indicates that Dr. Fauci, Rochelle Walensky, and the Surgeon General at the time were receiving information that the COVID vaccine was likely going to cause, miscarriages in a significant number of women. Now, they knew that data was there, that it was coming in. They had a study coming in that was showing that. With vaccinations, a lot of times we rely on post-administration data, and yet they told no one about this and raised no alarms. And that's why I think we need to restore some balance to this. It is one thing to show people data, and we should show people data that says that you should or should not take a vaccine or any other drug. However, when data comes in that shows that there are safety concerns, that has to be made public. Now, I understand, what went down here with the pandemic. It was a scary time, but that does not excuse public health officials from telling people the truth.
But why is it that Dr. Fauci, to this point, has not been charged with anything?
I'm sorry, could you ask that question
Why
again?
is it at this point in time that Dr. Fauci, in all this, he served in both administrations, has not been charged or indicted for anything? They're just hearings, which we continue to hear.
Well, he has a pardon. And that pardon stems from the date of President Obama's executive order pausing gain-of-function research back in 2014. One of the things that President Obama is reported to have said is that what keeps him up at night is worrying about gain-of-function research and what's going on in biolabs. And so back in 2014, when other scientists raised concern, President Obama put some guardrails on when gain-of-function research is to be done. And so that's what that pardon period covers. In my opinion, anyway, it seems to go back to when I would say that Mr. Fauci did an end run around President Obama's executive order.
Dr. Donohue, is the bigger scandal potentially not what scientists knew, but what they were willing or unwilling to tell the public?
I think that's right, Armstrong. There was a gap, which, as Lou points out, as new data arrives, that gap only grows. And there is no dishonor as a physician or as a clinical scientist in saying that you don't know. There is a great deal of dishonor in having good reason to think something is the case and not share that. And that is, I think, again and again what we see here. And it creates for us now, these years later, a deep and enduring crisis of faith, which can only hurt us should circumstances like COVID recur. So people now, when you speak publicly about this, it's interesting that the temper of the audience is angry, and people feel as if they've been duped on either side of the rail here. We don't make friends or cultivate relationships or even grow our own authority by not being candid. So, for example, the data that came out today is disturbing, and it immediately harkens back to many phone calls and patient visits that I personally had with pregnant women in the first trimester of their gestation who wondered about whether they should get this vaccine. And I told them what we knew, which at the time was nothing. And in fact, we did know things. And so that is it's interesting, Armstrong, just to remember that the only way into Dante's ninth circle of hell is the sin of betrayal.
Lou, your final thoughts?
Thank you.
Go ahead, Lou.
Yeah, I think that, one of the things I often think about is the position that doctors are placed in. And I see that the doctor used words like honor. The doctor-patient relationship is built on honor. And the physicians I've met in my life are honorable people. So, when information like this is withheld, it puts them in an untenable place. They should not be the subject of people's outrage. There are people in leadership, and it's not just Dr. Fauci, who should be held accountable.
Finally, Dr. Donohue, if another wave of COVID or the next virus comes along, everyday people are just not going to trust the institutions. They've lost trust. How do you restore it?
So that is an uphill struggle, and you're exactly right. And so we are now weaker, more feeble, more susceptible to great harm as a consequence of this debacle that we've now all lived through and are now looking back at. So I think that you're exactly right. And trust is everything. I mean, physicians use their training and their skill and their expertise and their relationship with the patients to persuade the patients to act in a way that comports with their better health. All you have to do is lie once, just lie once. And it's like a one-way ticket to hell. And it's turning out now that it's a painful reality coming kind of in a drip, drip, drip format. But it appears to be categorically the case. We do a lot, instead little.
Dr. Donohue, thank you. Lou, how do we get a copy of the MAHA report?
So you can visit us on our Substack page, the MAHA report. You can also get us through our website, mahaaction.com. And we have important articles written every day on a broad array of health and public health.
And sometimes you publish my editorials out of the Baltimore Sun.
We have been known to do that.
Yes. I want to thank all of our
Thank
you, Lou. I want to thank all our guests for joining us. Good night, everybody.
Good night. Thanks, Armstrong.